She knocked on the door like any other visitor. Elderly women opened with a smile, thinking she was a social worker. Minutes later, the apartment was silent, lifeless, the kettle still boiling. What they didn't know was that the woman in the skirt brought death with her. You're listening to Midnight Crime Stories, where every whisper carries a shadow and every night holds a darker secret. Tonight, we trace the chilling footsteps of Irina Gaidamachuk. To the world, she seemed like a troubled mother. But behind closed doors, she was something else entirely. They called her Satan in a skirt. It was 2002. The snow in Ekaterinburg hadn't melted yet, that dull, heavy kind that sticks around well into spring. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet only old apartment blocks and long winters can breed. It was here in one of those crumbling Soviet-era buildings that the horror began. The woman arrived just after 11 a.m. She carried a black shoulder bag, walked with quiet confidence, and wore a warm coat buttoned to the top. Her face unremarkable, her tone polite. A neighbor might have described her as one of those city workers, official enough to trust, forgettable enough to ignore. Her knock was firm, measured. The woman who answered, 82-year-old Galina Ivanovna, had seen decades of war and peace, but nothing prepared her for this. The visitor introduced herself as someone from the local social service department. She said there were updates to pension benefits, something about paperwork signatures verification. Galina nodded. Of course. These things happen. Come in, dear. The apartment smelled of boiled potatoes and old newspapers. Tea was already on the stove. She asked if the woman wanted a cup. The visitor smiled. Galina turned to the kitchen. That's when it happened. A strike to the back of the head. Quick, blunt, immediate. The room fell silent save for the whistle of the kettle. Irina moved with method. She searched the apartment drawers under the mattress behind the flower pots, gathering what little rubles the old woman had hidden away. Jewelry, too, though most of it wasn't worth more than sentiment. She left through the back entrance unnoticed. No scream, no struggle, no sign of forced entry. Just another day in the block. Another old woman who wouldn't be calling her family tonight. For the police, it looked like a robbery. A tragic but not uncommon event in post-Soviet suburbs. The files were stamped, closed too soon. But for Irina Gaidamachuk, it was just the beginning. Before she became a name whispered in fear, Irina Gaidamachuk was just another child born into the cold shadows of Soviet-era Russia. She entered the world in 1972 in the small town of Nyagan, a remote outpost in western Siberia. Even in childhood, her surroundings were bleak, long winters, tight rations, broken families. Her father was an alcoholic, unpredictable, absent, and cruel. Her mother tried to hold the household together, but even she couldn't protect Irina from the neglect that surrounded them. The girl learned early how to disappear into silence. She became a watcher, observing, calculating. Teachers noted she was quiet, too quiet, withdrawn, easily irritated, and prone to lying. But in a place where everyone struggled, her behavior went mostly unnoticed. What's one more troubled child in a generation raised by vodka and trauma? In her teenage years, alcohol became her escape. Vodka blurred the shame, dulled the ache of poverty. She would steal money from her own mother just to keep the buzz going. That buzz over time became a hunger, an unrelenting need. She dropped out of school, drifted between jobs, and by her early 20s, she had already developed a dependency she could no longer hide. And yet beneath it all, there was a strange kind of cunning. A mask she wore well. She knew when to smile, when to cry, when to lie. And she knew how to manipulate those around her. Eventually, she met Yuri, a quiet laborer who, perhaps like Irina, was simply looking for someone who wouldn't leave. They had children, a family. For a brief moment, life seemed almost normal, but the monster never left. It just waited, beneath the surface, brewing. Irina's drinking spiraled. She stole from neighbors. She'd disappear for days. Her children remember her rage, unpredictable and volcanic. Yuri threatened to leave many times, but always returned. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he believed she would change. She never did. And somewhere in the dark corridors of her mind, a thought took root. No one misses the old ones. No one cares if they're gone. That was the seed. And soon it would grow into something unthinkable. To outsiders, Irina appeared functional. Not happy, perhaps, but stable enough. The type of woman who might scold her kids too harshly, but still made dinner. Still showed up for parent meetings sometimes. Her neighbors in Krasnofimsk saw a woman who dressed plainly, didn't socialize much, but never caused public scenes. But behind closed doors, Irina's world was spiraling. Her 2 children bore the brunt of her storms. Screaming fits would erupt over spilled tea. A misplaced toy could result in hours of silence or days of punishment. Yuri, often exhausted from his construction shifts, would retreat into the background, numbing himself with his own vices. The household was not a war zone, not visibly. It was something quieter, more sinister. A place where fear lived in the cracks of the floorboards. Irina's addiction was no longer about pleasure, it was survival. Every ruble she scraped together went to vodka. When there was no vodka, she shook. Her hands trembled. Her mouth twitched. Her rage surfaced. She began pawning household items, borrowing from neighbors and never returning it. She once convinced a local grocer to give her food on credit, promising she'd pay when Yuri's wages came in. She never did. Yuri's tolerance faded. He threatened divorce. He even took the children and left for his sister's home once. But Irina knew how to pull him back. Tears, promises, that whisper of the woman he once loved still hiding behind tired eyes. He came back. He always came back. And while the family tried to pretend normal, Irina's darkness began to evolve. Killing became more than a necessity. It became a routine, a means to fuel the bottle and soothe the beast within. She justified it in whispers. They're old. They've lived their lives. I'm just taking what I need. In her twisted mind, she wasn't evil. She was surviving. And no one seemed to notice the old women disappearing. Not yet. It didn't take long before Irina developed a rhythm. She would scout neighborhoods quietly, looking for buildings that housed mostly pensioners, the ones with chipped paint, creaky elevators, and empty stairwells. Her targets were always the same elderly women living alone, vulnerable, isolated, often forgotten. She would dress conservatively. Sometimes she wore a scarf and carried a clipboard. Other times, she wore a long coat and said she was from the gas company. Her voice was soft, her manner calm. She asked polite questions. She even smiled. She was the perfect disguise of trust. Once inside, it followed the same pattern. Small talk tea, a distraction. Then the blow. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head. She never used a gun, never a knife. It was always quick, brutal, and quiet. Then came the rummaging. Drawers pulled open, pillows overturned, closets searched. Her prize, a few thousand rubles at best. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. The act itself had become ritual. The victims never saw it coming. Over a period of 8 years, more than a dozen elderly women were found dead in similar conditions. No signs of forced entry, little noise, minimal mess. Most were labeled accidental deaths. Some were ruled as domestic accidents. A few were even cremated before autopsies could be done. The fog of bureaucracy, combined with overworked investigators and assumptions about the victim's age, played into Irina's hands perfectly. It wasn't until 2005, 3 years after Galina Ivanovna's death, that a junior detective in Krasnofimsk began noticing a strange detail. Tea kettles, still whistling. In nearly every case, the water had boiled dry. That detail stuck with him. It wasn't definitive, but it was something. He compiled the reports and found more similarities. No signs of struggle missing small items, all victims, female, elderly, and living alone. He brought it to his superiors. They dismissed it. Coincidence, they said. Elderly people fall. They forget things. They burn water. It happens. But the detective kept watching, kept digging. Meanwhile, Irina kept killing, and the fog around her thickened. By 2006, quiet rumors had begun to spread. It started in stairwells and grocery lines. At bus stops, in the waiting rooms of polyclinics, elderly women whispered to each other. "Did you hear about Marina from Building 4? She let someone in, said it was a social worker. Now she's gone." At first it sounded like folklore, neighborhood paranoia. But the more it happened, the more the pieces started to align. The stories were all eerily similar. A woman knocks, pretends to be helpful. The old woman disappears. Families grew nervous. Sons and daughters called their mothers more often. Some even installed second locks. A few moved their relatives out of those apartment blocks entirely. Still no warning came from the authorities. There were no press briefings, no public statements, no bulletins urging caution. Because to the police, there was no confirmed connection. Their records didn't link the deaths. They didn't see the pattern or didn't want to. To admit a serial killer was on the loose, it would mean explaining how she'd walked free for years under their watch. So the fear continued to fester in silence. Elderly women began to keep their doors locked in the daytime. They refused unexpected visitors. Some would only open if they recognized the voice. But not all of them could hear clearly. Not all of them remembered warnings. And Irina knew this. She counted on it. She changed her routes more often now. Took buses to different districts, wore different coats, different shoes. Sometimes she even wore glasses. She blended in like wallpaper, and still the knock came, and the tea boiled, and another woman disappeared into silence. In late autumn of 2007, Irina made what could have been her final mistake. She targeted an apartment complex she hadn't visited before a weather-worn building on the edge of town where the elevators had long stopped working. Her victim that day was Vera Petrovna, age 79. But Vera wasn't like the others. She was hard of hearing, but sharp. When Irina knocked and introduced herself as a nurse from the health department, Vera hesitated. Something in the woman's eyes made her uneasy. But Irina's smile was soft. Her voice was calm, and her hands trembling just slightly reminded Vera of her own daughter. She let her in. Within minutes, Irina was inside, helping herself to the kitchen table, talking about checking blood pressure, asking for tea. But when Irina excused herself to the bathroom, Vera did something unusual. She followed. And from the hallway, she watched Irina quietly slip a heavy glass vase into her coat. Vera backed away without a sound, heart pounding. She returned to the kitchen, picked up her phone, and dialed 3 digits not to speak, just to be ready. When Irina returned vase in hand, something in Vera's eyes had changed. She asked Irina to leave. Calmly, firmly. Irina didn't fight it. She smiled again and left. Vera didn't sleep that night. The next day, she told her niece. The niece told the police. A description was given: brunette, mid-40s, soft voice, heavy coat. Possibly a fake badge, possibly a nurse. But the report was buried. Not because of incompetence, but because it was one of dozens like it. "We'll investigate," they said. Could be nothing. Weeks later, another woman was found dead. The cracks in the system weren't just wide. They were invisible. Irina was close to being caught, but the fog she moved in was just thick enough to cover her tracks again. It wasn't a high-profile reassignment. In fact, it was buried in paperwork. Detective Sergei Mikhailov had just been moved to Ekaterinburg after closing a robbery case in Nizhny Novgorod. He was exhausted and skeptical. Most of his days were spent reviewing petty theft reports and neighborhood disputes, until he was handed the Denya file. It was a cold case, one of many, but something about it gnawed at him. An elderly woman found dead in her home. Nothing stolen but a cheap pair of earrings. No signs of forced entry, no sexual motive. But the death was violent, blunt force trauma to the head. Sergei dug deeper. He pulled up similar files from the last 3 years. There were more than he expected. Dozens. Most were written off as isolated domestic incidents, break-ins gone wrong, or even accidents. But he saw a thread. Same victim profile, elderly women living alone. Same circumstances, no forced entry. Nothing valuable stolen, usually a kitchen item used as the murder weapon. Same regions. Same silence. He spent nights mapping locations on an old police board using colored pins. It was like connecting stars, and a pattern emerged. It wasn't random. Whoever was doing this had a system. He took the findings to his superior. They nodded. politely, mumbled something about resources and overreach. But Sergei wasn't done. He contacted family members, survivors. He even found the report from Vera Petrovna's niece, and there it was a match. He added her name to the board. Then another, and another. The case wasn't cold anymore. It was simmering. And in the shadows of every pin he placed, Sergei began to feel the presence of someone watching, not literally, but spiritually. As if the killer had left fingerprints, not on doorknobs, but in the air itself. What he didn't know was that the killer already knew someone was following her trail, and she was ready. The break came late one night when Sergei was combing through public employment registries and welfare databases. It wasn't a glamorous lead, but then again, neither were the murders. He filtered for women aged 35-50 with irregular employment records tied to state institutions or caregiving services. It took hours, and then a name popped up. Irina Gaidamachuk. She had applied for temporary janitorial work in 3 separate towns, all within the same districts where victims had been found. Nothing alarming. But then Sergei noticed the dates. Each job application was submitted just weeks before a body turned up. Irina had used a forged address, but the contact number led to a rehabilitation center. He called the facility. After some initial hesitation, a former staff member confirmed Irina had been admitted more than once. Alcohol dependency, short stays, non-compliant, vanished more than once. And in one intake form, Sergei found a handwritten note. Irina speaks softly, deferential tone, manipulative, avoids eye contact when asked about children. It chilled him. She wasn't invisible. She was ignored. He requested more records, welfare visits, psychiatric evaluations, even prison release logs. It painted a haunting timeline. Her rehab stints, her job hops, her disappearances, all fell within a radius of death. Irina had drifted through these towns like smoke-touching walls, whispering names and fading. And suddenly the map Sergei had built didn't look like a constellation. It looked like a hunting route. Sergei knew they needed bait. But real lives were not pawns. He proposed an unorthodox plan: create fictional elderly profiles planted strategically in the registry offices of towns near Irina's last known movements. He gave them stories, names, backstories, medical needs, and ensured the information quietly circulated through channels Irina might intercept: hospital staff, churches, local aid programs. Then he waited. In one quiet town outside Sverdlovsk, an apartment was outfitted with hidden surveillance. A retired female officer posed as the new resident. 3 days passed. Nothing. On the 4th night, the buzzer rang. The officer hesitated before answering. A woman stood at the door, hunched slightly, scarf wrapped tightly, eyes darting. She claimed she was from the local assistance office. Said she was doing check-ins for heating subsidies. They let her in, but something felt off. The woman never made direct eye contact. Her bag was too heavy for a clipboard. When she reached for the kitchen, the officer gave the signal. The hidden team moved in, but the woman was gone. She had slipped out, down the fire escape. Inside her abandoned bag, only 2 items: a worn-out rubber mallet and an address scribbled in red pen 1 block away. She had been watching them longer than they had been watching her. Sergei was furious, but also electrified. This was confirmation she was out there, alive, hunting, but she was also adapting. And now she knew they were hunting her too. After the failed sting, Irina seemed to vanish into the wind again, but not for long. Reports started coming in: unverified sightings, whispers of a woman in a red headscarf knocking on doors asking about grandmothers who lived alone. Sergei reviewed them all. Most were noise, but one stood out. An elderly man, half blind, claimed a woman had come to his flat posing as a nurse. She had asked strange questions, not about his health, but about his neighbors. Specifically, if anyone nearby lived alone. She had offered him tea. He declined. She left. 2 days later, the neighbor across the hall was dead. Now the pattern twisted. Irina wasn't just hunting. She was studying, plotting. Sergei ordered another decoy, this time a mobile unit inside a retirement housing complex. Cameras hidden behind smoke detectors. The bait apartment dressed to look lived in. Day 6. A knock. This time she pushed. She claimed to be from the gas company. The officer inside didn't challenge her. The goal was capture, not confrontation. But when she walked into the kitchen, she turned. She looked directly at the officer and whispered, "You're not like the others," and swung a hammer. The officer dodged, barely. The team burst in. Irina scrambled, clawed, bit, but this time she didn't escape. In her coat pocket was a folded list. 9 names, all women, all over 70, all still alive. Irina didn't just kill out of impulse. She was planning her next season. Sergei stared at the list for hours that night. Each name was a whisper of death waiting to be heard, and he had heard it just in time. They placed her in a quiet room, stark and cold, no windows. Just her and Sergei with a small tape recorder resting between them. Irina sat with her legs crossed, hands gently folded in her lap. Her eyes were still unblinking, unreadable. Not the wild-eyed mania they had expected. Not even a flicker of regret. Sergei pressed record. "What was it you were looking for when you knocked on their doors?" A pause. A smile. Softly. "Peace." He leaned in. "What kind of peace?" "The kind that doesn't scream back at you. The kind that's quiet, like after the kettle stops whistling." She spoke of her victims as if they were characters in bedtime stories, each one a puzzle piece in some grim fable she was writing. She remembered names, details, what they wore, what they served her, what their last words were. But she never once said the word kill. Instead, she used phrases like, "I sent her to sleep. I turned the page. I gave her silence." Sergei asked if she felt remorse. "I don't believe in remorse," Irina said. "It's just another way of holding on to noise." Then she asked him a question. "Do you ever dream of silence, Sergei?" He didn't answer, because in that moment he realized something chilling. Irina didn't see herself as evil. She saw herself as necessary, a purifier, a calm in the chaos. And that made her far more dangerous than he ever imagined. It began in a town so quiet the snow made more noise than the people. Irina's childhood wasn't documented in official records, not completely. But neighbors remembered the silence. A house where shouting was replaced by slamming doors and bruises were covered with long sleeves and longer silences. Her father was a drinker. Her mother a ghost who wandered the kitchen, never smiling. There were no lullabies in that house. Only clinks of empty vodka bottles and the hum of a television playing to no one. At age 7, Irina was already used to skipping meals. At 8, she learned to disappear to make herself small in corners. At 10, she stopped speaking unless spoken to. Silence to her was not absence. It was survival. One neighbor recalled seeing young Irina staring out the window for hours, not watching the world, just observing how it ignored her. When she turned 14, she ran away for the first time. A brief escape. But even on the streets, she sought out the quiet, abandoned stairwells, empty lots. Places where voices didn't reach. Years later, when social workers interviewed her, they were struck not by what she said, but how she said it. No emotion, just clinical, almost like reciting a grocery list of trauma, and buried beneath all of it that yearning, not for love, not even for understanding, but for quiet. A stillness she never got. So she created it, with a hammer, with fire, with hands that once held a baby now reaching for elderly throats. Her past wasn't an excuse, but it was a mirror. And when Sergei stared into it, he didn't just see Irina. He saw all the faces society failed before she ever knocked on that first door. It was a cold morning in Yekaterinburg when Irina Gaidamachuk was led into the courtroom. She wore no handcuffs, just a plain brown coat, and the same eerie calm that followed her since her arrest. Her gaze drifted across the room, past the reporters, past the crowd, and landed squarely on the jury box as if they were the only people who mattered. The media dubbed her Satan in a skirt, and the courtroom was overflowing. Cameras clicked like insects. Headlines were already being drafted before she even took the stand. But Irina didn't flinch. She listened head tilted as prosecutors listed the names of her victims. 14 confirmed, maybe more. All elderly women, all bludgeoned. Most of them burned afterward. Each name echoed like a church bell, but Irina blinked only once. No tears, no twitch. Just silence. When the families of the victims took the stand, some couldn't even speak. One woman held up her mother's charred teapot, a quiet monument to what was stolen. Another victim's son shouted through his tears, "You robbed her of her last cup of tea, her last breath." Irina looked at him, not with hatred, not with remorse, but with curiosity, as if wondering why he hadn't gone silent yet. Psychologists were brought in. One said she showed signs of antisocial personality disorder. Another said she had no moral compass but clear planning ability. But Sergei, now a key witness, said something different. She's not insane. She's not broken. She's deliberate, cold, but not chaotic. That's what makes her terrifying. When asked to speak in her own defense, Irina stood. She looked around the courtroom, eyes calm, voice flat. I didn't do it for money. I did it because they were already halfway gone. I just helped them cross. Gasps, murmurs, a judge striking the gavel. Irina sat back down as if she'd just read a weather report. And outside the courthouse, it started to snow. The courtroom held its breath. After weeks of testimonies, psychological evaluations, and chilling evidence, the judge returned with a verdict. The silence was deafening as the room braced for it. Guilty on all counts. Irina did not blink. The sentence, 20 years in prison, the maximum penalty for women under Russian law at the time. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Some gasped in disbelief, 20 years for 14 murders. Others wept silently, clutching the memories of their lost mothers, grandmothers, neighbors. The prosecutor called it a miscarriage of justice. The defense called it mercy. The public, they called it not enough. Outside, news anchors gathered in the snow. One reporter whispered, "Satan in a skirt will be out before some of her victims' grandchildren graduate college." In her final moments in court, Irina was asked if she had anything else to say. She stood up, turned to the families, and said, "You blame me for death, but I never lied about what I was. Can you say the same?" Then she smiled. It was the first and last time anyone had seen her do that. As she was escorted away, she glanced at the falling snow and murmured something no one could hear. But Sergei, the investigator, claimed she said, "Winter keeps secrets better than people." The doors closed, and the shadow of Irina faded into the prison system, but never from memory. Years after her conviction, the name Irina Gaidamachuk still sends a chill down the spine of Yekaterinburg. The buildings she visited where tea kettles boiled their last have long since been repainted, sold, forgotten. But the memories, the scars, remain. On the anniversaries of the killings, families still light candles. A bench near a modest housing block bears a faded plaque etched with the names of the victims. It reads, "Gone in silence, remembered in whispers." Irina's name is barely mentioned in official circles anymore. Russian authorities don't celebrate her capture. They don't speak about the investigative failures or the time lost. But among criminologists and psychologists, her case is still studied not because of its brutality, but because of its banality. She didn't look like a monster. She didn't act like one. That was the horror. Sergei, the investigator, retired a few years later. In a rare interview, he said, "She haunts me most on quiet days, days when the wind stops and everything is still. That's when I remember." She walked calmly. No rush, no guilt. Like she belonged in their homes. Legally, her case sparked a wave of policy reviews about care for the elderly and the oversight of social services. But no laws could undo the fact that for 9 years, Irina hunted the vulnerable without consequence. In 2023, there were rumors she'd be released early for good behavior. The public outcry was immediate. Hashtags trended, protests formed, but the prison system remained silent. Some say she's still there in a gray cell quietly reading. Others believe she's been moved, her identity changed, face reconstructed. And some whisper, she's not done. Maybe she'll return. Or maybe, as she once said, winter keeps secrets better than people. Thank you for listening to Midnight Crime Stories. Subscribe for more whispered true crime tales to accompany your sleepless nights.